I was on a forum the other day, one of those relationship recovery spaces.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and a man was telling his story, describing his ex-partner with this really potent mix of like awe and bitterness.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about how charming she was, how attractive, how she managed her image perfectly. But to him, this wasn't just effort.
Right.
It was narcissistic seduction. He was absolutely convinced he'd been the victim of a dark conspiracy, designed to entrap and drain him.
Wow, strong language.
Totally. And as I scrolled, the comments were just a flood of agreement, hundreds of people, all with their own stories of the manipulative, image-driven woman. It was presented as this obvious, self-evident truth.
Yeah, that narrative is powerful online.
But then I saw a statistic that just stopped me. The actual clinical diagnosis for narcissistic personality disorder, well, it's given to men 50 to 75% of the time.
Right, that's the DSM-5 data.
Suddenly, that whole conversation felt different. This massive shared cultural truth about the manipulative female narcissist. What if it's not a diagnosis at all? What if it's just a very old suspicion? One that's existed for centuries, now just dressed up in new psychological language.
That's a fascinating starting point.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Yeah.
This whole cultural phenomenon, this pathologizing of partners, right? Often women using these, clinical terms like narcissist. That's really what we want to dive into today. Our mission is kind of to measure that widespread cultural assumption against, rigorous clinical psychological research and modern relational theory.
Good.
We want to see what is actually happening clinically, what drives these intense accusations psychologically, and I guess most importantly, what's the constructive alternative for understanding and maybe resolving relationship conflict.
It's the perfect mission for a deep dive, definitely, because that dissonance you highlighted right at the start between the cultural consensus and the clinical reality, it's not just interesting, it really reveals some fundamental flaws.
Flaws in how personality pathology is diagnosed.
Yeah, how it's diagnosed and how it's understood, especially outside of a therapist's office. It's twisted.
Okay, so let's start right there with that staggering statistical disconnect you mentioned. Up to 75% of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, diagnoses are male, according to the DSM-5, our official diagnostic manual.
Right.
But the cultural narrative, you see it everywhere. It's often the manipulative, image-obsessed woman who's held up as the archetype. So why? Why is the clinical definition so heavily weighted towards men?
Well, the answer really lies in what the DSM-5 criteria explicitly measure and what they prioritize.
Okay.
The current way we conceptualize NPD, at least in that manual, it primarily captures overt grandiosity.
Overt grandiosity, so like the really obvious stuff.
Exactly. Think about the 9 criteria needed for a diagnosis. You've got interpersonal exploitation, a massive sense of entitlement, preoccupation with these self-serving fantasies of success or power, arrogance, exhibitionism.
Right, the classic, look at me, I'm amazing, do what I say kind of picture.
That's the grandiose presentation in a nutshell. Those are the hallmarks.
And these specific grandiose features, exploitation, entitlement, exhibitionism, historically and sociologically, you could argue these are traits more closely linked to traditional male socialization patterns, right?
Precisely. That's a key point many clinical theorists have made for decades. This conception of narcissism, it largely originated in work that disproportionately studied male patients.
Ah, so the model itself was built on a biased sample, essentially.
You could say that. The resulting diagnostic template, it aligns much more naturally with characteristics we traditionally link to how males are socialized, displaying aggression, seeking power and status, demanding authority, needing constant external validation of their superiority.
So if the diagnostic manual is basically looking for a loud, overtly entitled person demanding resources and admiration.
It's structurally kind of built to capture the masculine expression of that pathology more readily.
Okay, so just hypothetically, if a woman were to meet that full diagnostic criteria for NPD, according to the DSM-5, she'd have to show those overt, aggressive, grandiose features, the textbook stuff.
Yes, she'd need to tick those specific boxes. But we know personality pathology isn't a monolith, right? It's not that simple.
Definitely not. And this is where we need to bring in the other side of the coin, the often overlooked counterpart, vulnerable narcissism.
Absolutely. And this is where the official diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, kind of underappreciates things.
Yeah.
It doesn't really capture this vulnerable variant of narcissism well, which many theorists suggest might actually be more prevalent in females.
The quieter, more defensive side, you said.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Can you lay out the vulnerable traits for us? Like, what does this actually look like compared to the aggressive entitlement of the grandiose type we just discussed?
Sure. So the core pathology, this deep need for validation, a severely fragile sense of self that remains the same, but the expression is fundamentally different. Vulnerable narcissism is characterized more by things like shyness, deep hypersensitivity to criticism, a lot of rumination, shame, and feelings of low self-esteem.
So they still feel superior, maybe deep down.
Yes, the entitlement and the sense of specialness are often still there, but instead of demanding recognition aggressively like the grandiose type,
They react differently when they don't get it.
right, they tend to withdraw when validation isn't forthcoming. They internalize criticism, even minor slights, very deeply. They operate from this really defensive, shame-based position.
Wow, that distinction is crucial. Because if the pathology is there, but it manifests as shyness and hypersensitivity, well, that creates a huge diagnostic blind spot.
Exactly. Especially since the DSM-5 tells clinicians to look for exhibitionism and exploitation.
So the narcissism could easily be missed altogether, or maybe mistaken for something else entirely.
Precisely. Which leads us directly into the really tricky issue of diagnostic bias.
Okay, let's go there, because this is where the clinical research starts to back up that suspicion, right?
It does. There was a key study we looked at that investigated this very gender bias in how clinicians perceive things. They used hypothetical case vignettes.
So, like written descriptions of patients?
Exactly. The researchers created these profiles of patients presenting with really clear symptoms of vulnerable narcissism, the shame, the low self-esteem, the extreme sensitivity to minor slights we just talked about.
Okay.
And then they asked a diverse group of clinicians to read these vignettes and rate the likelihood of various personality disorder diagnoses.
That sounds like a pretty powerful way to test it, because the clinicians aren't diagnosing real people, just reading text descriptions.
Right, which should minimize some external biases.
But it still allows those implicit gender stereotypes to potentially creep in, maybe based just on the name attached to the story, like patient A is Jane versus patient A is John.
That's the idea. So when these clinicians saw those vulnerable symptoms laid out, what diagnoses do you think were most frequently endorsed?
Based on what you said about mistaking it, maybe anxiety disorders or depression?
Those might be present too. But in terms of personality disorders, the ones that came up most frequently were borderline personality disorder, BPD, dependent personality disorder, DPD, and avoidant personality disorder, APD.
Wait a minute. BPD, DPD, APD. All three of those diagnoses have historically shown an overrepresentation of women in clinical settings, haven't they?
They have, massively so in some cases.
So, are we saying that a narcissistic pathology, when it presents vulnerably, is basically just being filtered through these established feminine disorder stereotypes?
We are. And the data supported what the researchers called the gender flip.
The gender flip, what's that?
Clinicians were significantly more likely to diagnose female patients presenting with those vulnerable narcissism symptoms as having BPD compared to male patients who presented with the identical symptom set.
Whoa, okay, that's a really staggering finding. Let that sink in.
It is.
It means that the high number of women diagnosed with BPD or DPD might, at least in part, be an artifact of how clinicians interpret narcissistic vulnerability when they see it in a female body.
Instead of recognizing the underlying pathology, that fragile, entitled self expressing itself through withdrawal and sensitivity, they might default to the stereotype of emotional instability, which is often what BPD gets reductively associated with.
That seems to be the core relevance here. The symptoms do overlap quite a bit, right? BPD involves hypersensitivity, intense emotional reactions, unstable relationships.
Exactly. And vulnerable narcissism shares that hypersensitivity and relational volatility because the person is constantly scanning for and reacting to perceived slights. It makes relationships very difficult.
But there are differences, too.
Yes. BPD usually involves a more profound identity disturbance, chronic feelings of emptiness. Vulnerable narcissism is more about that defensive self-aggrandizement hidden behind the shame. But when these overlapping, ambiguous symptoms show up in a woman, the traditional idea of BPD seems to often override the potential recognition of narcissism.
Okay, I have to push back just a little here just to be thorough. BPD is a distinct and serious diagnosis. How can we be so sure clinicians are misdiagnosing narcissism here, rather than just accurately diagnosing BPD, even if the symptoms look similar on the surface?
That's an excellent and really important point. The research isn't suggesting that BPD is never the correct diagnosis for these women.
Okay.
It's suggesting that the bias influences the diagnostic choice, especially when the symptoms are ambiguous or overlap significantly. The crucial control variable in that study was key.
What did they control for?
They also looked at how clinicians diagnosed grandiose narcissism, the overt exploitative presentation.
The classic type.
Right, and for grandiose narcissism, the study found that clinicians attributed the NPD diagnosis in a gender-neutral fashion.
Okay, that's the clincher. So when the patient presents like the textbook caricature of NPD, overtly demanding, arrogant, exploitative, the gender of the patient doesn't seem to matter much. The diagnosis sticks regardless.
Exactly. That finding suggests that the clinical concept of NPD isn't exclusively seen as male pathology in the minds of clinicians. The bias really emerges specifically when the patient presents vulnerably.
Because those ambiguous symptoms, the shame, the dependency, the sensitivity, they look too much like the criteria for disorders already stereotypically associated with women, like BPD and DPD.
Precisely. It's like a double layer of gender bias operating. First, the DSM-5 structure itself favors the male expression, focusing on grandiosity.
Right.
And second, clinician interpretation of the vulnerable expression seems to favor female stereotypes, leading to misattribution.
Wow. And the researchers didn't stop there, did they? They also looked at the clinicians themselves, their background.
Yes, and that offered perhaps the deepest insight. They found that clinicians with this psychodynamic orientation.
Okay, like Freudian influenced, focusing on unconscious processes.
Broadly speaking, yes. Those clinicians, and also clinicians with more years of experience, were significantly more likely to attribute the NPD diagnosis to these vulnerable cases compared to clinicians using primarily a cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT approach.
Interesting. Why would a psychodynamic approach be better at catching this sort of hidden narcissism?
Well, it really comes down to the underlying philosophy of diagnosis. The DSM-5 is fundamentally a categorical manual. You either meet the criteria or you don't, based on hitting X number of specific observable symptoms.
Like a checklist.
Pretty much. Psychodynamic models, on the other hand, which informed alternative diagnostic manuals like the PDM-2, tend to take a more dimensional view.
Dimensional, meaning?
Meaning they focus more on the underlying personality structure, the internal world, the defense mechanisms, and the relational patterns, rather than just the surface behavior.
So a psychodynamically oriented clinician is trained to ask not just what are the symptoms, but what is the underlying organization of this person's self? And what function does this behavior serve? What is it defending against?
Precisely. They're theoretically equipped to recognize the underlying narcissistic pathology, the severely fragile self, trying desperately to regulate itself, even when the outward presentation is masked by shame, shyness, or hypersensitivity.
Whereas a strictly CBT approach, which is excellent for many things, like symptom management.
Right. It focuses more on those immediate observable symptoms and the cognitions driving them. So if the patient isn't exhibiting the overt grandiose symptoms that the DSM-5 emphasizes, a CBT-oriented clinician might perhaps more easily default to BPD or DPD based on the vulnerable presentation, potentially missing that deeper narcissistic structure.
So the study really suggests that the current DSM framework is, well, potentially flawed for capturing the full spectrum of narcissism, especially as it might manifest in women.
It certainly raises that question.
And it forces clinicians who want accuracy perhaps to rely on alternative, more holistic models, or simply on years and years of acquired gut feeling, that experiential knowledge.
That seems to be the implication. The finding that more experienced clinicians were more likely to see the NPD in vulnerable cases supports that idea. They've likely learned through practice to look past the surface symptoms.
And that gap, that inconsistency in clinical perception, that's precisely what gets picked up and, frankly, weaponized in the public sphere, isn't it?
Absolutely. If trained experts struggle to define and diagnose pathology accurately when it's non-stereotypical, just imagine what happens when everyday people start throwing these clinical terms around in the heat of relationship conflict.
Which brings us right to the sociocultural critique. How does this clinical diagnosis, NPD, become culturally weaponized, particularly against women? We often see women pathologized simply for engaging in what seem like pretty normal behaviors.
Like what, for instance?
Like being charming or attractive or confident, or just, engaging in self-presentation, taking care of their appearance, grooming, maybe even being flirtatious in a social setting.
Right. And this is where the sociocultural analysis becomes absolutely necessary. Attributing clinical NPD to a woman simply because she's good at presenting herself, or seeks attention, or enjoys her appearance? Well, Some critics label that kind of thinking as anthropologically illiterate.
Anthropologically illiterate, meaning it ignores basic human nature.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It completely ignores the fact that self-presentation, signaling status, attracting a mate, these are universally human behaviors. They're deeply tied to our species-specific mating systems, to social dynamics.
We're talking about basic evolutionary imperatives here, aren't we?
Right.
Grooming, aesthetic care, signaling attraction. These aren't inherently personality disorders.
Of course not. They're inherent parts of the human condition, part of social competition and connection.
So weaponizing the clinical term narcissism in this way, what's underneath that?
Well, the argument is that it often reflects a deeper societal discomfort, maybe even an anxiety, with female agency and autonomy. When a woman is confident, attractive, maybe assertive, independent, when she seems to have power over her own image and choices that can sometimes be interpreted not as healthy self-esteem or normal biological signaling, but as something pathological, as exploitation or manipulation.
And labeling it narcissism becomes a convenient way to do that.
It can be. It serves as a subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, mechanism for dismissing female confidence, independence, or assertiveness, especially if it challenges traditional gender expectations about how women should behave. Maybe be more accommodating, less self-focused.
Yeah, the label becomes this destructive shortcut, doesn't it? Instead of grappling with the complex challenge of relating to a partner who's maybe confident or successful or self-directed in ways that feel unfamiliar or threatening.
You just slap the narcissist label on them.
Yeah.
It shuts down the conversation immediately by assigning this heavy moralistic fault. Problem solved, but not really.
And this pathologizing, this labeling, it seems to happen most intensely when conflict is really at its peak, right?
Oh, absolutely. The person leveling the accusation of narcissism at their partner often does so with this overwhelming conviction. There's a powerful feeling behind it, a feeling of having been deeply hurt, betrayed, manipulated.
But where does that intensity come from if it's not always an accurate clinical assessment?
Often the psychoanalytic perspective suggests it stems not from objective analysis of the partner's traits, but from an unconscious relational process. Something rooted deep in the accuser's own history.
Okay, so what does this mean for these accusations flying around in relationships? Why does one partner feel so compelled, so certain, that they need to project such a definitive, destructive diagnosis onto the other?
This is where we really need to delve into the psychoanalytic concept of projective identification. It sounds complex, but it's crucial for understanding this dynamic.
Projective identification. Break that down for us.
Okay, so it's a dense but really vital psychoanalytic idea. It basically describes an unconscious process where a person deals with unwanted, intolerable parts of their own self.
Unwanted parts like what?
Like their own relational deficits, maybe their own hidden narcissistic tendencies, their deep-seated anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, or unresolved issues from their early life, their schemas.
Okay.
And they deal with these intolerable parts by unconsciously attributing them, or sort of putting them into their partner, projecting them outward.
Let's pause there for a second. Can we use an analogy? It sounds almost like an emotional hot potato.
That's actually a great way to put it. Yeah. The person doing the projecting, let's call them the projector, feels they can no longer hold on to this hot potato. Maybe the potato is, say, a profound fear of being inadequate.
Okay, they can't stand feeling inadequate.
Right. So unconsciously, they toss that hot potato to the recipient, their partner, but it doesn't stop there.
What happens next?
The projector then unconsciously behaves in ways that subtly, or not so subtly, coerce the partner into actually feeling and reflecting that projected part.
So if I project my own feeling of inadequacy onto you,
I might constantly criticize your competence, find fault with everything you do, maybe undermine your confidence until you actually start feeling anxious and incompetent yourself.
and that then validates my initial projection. See? I told you. You're the incompetent one.
Exactly. The original pathology, my feeling of inadequacy, isn't actually solved or healed. It's just been relocated into the relationship dynamic itself. It becomes a shared reality, but a toxic one.
And you mentioned this unconscious baggage often comes from our past. Unresolved conflicts, maybe schemas formed during childhood with parents.
That's the typical psychoanalytic understanding. The current relationship, often marriage, becomes the stage, the arena, for unconsciously reenacting these old, unresolved childhood struggles and relational patterns.
Wow. And research has actually looked at this process in marriage.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Studies examining projective identification in relation to marital satisfaction have even categorized it into two distinct types, showing just how pervasive this mechanism can be in shaping how couples relate. especially under stress.
Okay, let's break down those two types of projective identification that researchers observed in marriage dynamics. What's the first one?
The first is called persecuting projective identification. And the name kind of gives it away.
Sounds negative.
It is. This involves the projection of highly destructive negative parts, deep-seated fear, anxiety, maybe hatred, resentment onto the partner. This is the mechanism that likely fuels those really intense accusations, like the one you described from the forum at the start. You are a narcissist. You are deliberately trying to destroy me.
Right. And what did the research find about the measurable effects of this persecuting type on the relationship?
Well, as you'd expect, it is strongly and negatively correlated with marital satisfaction. Couples where this is happening are deeply unhappy.
Nonsense.
And, crucially, it's also positively linked to negative conflict resolution styles.
Like what?
Like aggression, hostility, stonewalling, excessive anger. This process essentially ensures that the couple keeps transferring these raw, early childhood conflicts onto each other. It creates this relentless, painful recreation of past trauma within the current relationship.
Which leads directly to significant marital distress. It sounds like the engine room for that kind of moralistic, blaming discourse we hear so much about. It's all your fault.
That's a very good way to put it. So, the person who insists with absolute certainty that their partner is a clinical narcissist designed only to exploit them. From this perspective, they are likely engaging in a powerful form of persecuting projective identification. They're transferring their own deep-seated fears, maybe fears of inadequacy, abandonment, or manipulation learned long ago onto their partner.
Okay, that's the persecuting type. What's the second type identified in the research?
The second type is called idealizing projective identification.
Idealizing. That sounds better.
On the surface, yes. This involves the attribution of exclusively good qualities, like immense love, perfect empathy, unwavering closeness, total supportiveness onto the partner. The partner is seen as perfect, the source of all goodness.
Okay, well, that definitely sounds much better than the persecuting type. You're saying it's still a defense mechanism. It's still projective identification.
Yes, because it's still rooted in an unconscious need and a distortion of reality. While this idealizing type is positively correlated with marital satisfaction, partners feel safe and loved when they're idealized. The studies also found it was correlated with things like subordination behaviors and self-sacrificing tendencies in the projector.
So the person doing the idealizing might be putting themselves down.
Exactly. The projector unconsciously attributes all the goodness externally onto the partner, perhaps because they can't tolerate the idea of having flaws or negative traits themselves. Or maybe they desperately fear losing this perfect partner who feels like the sole source of their emotional regulation and self-worth.
So it creates this kind of rigid, albeit positive feeling dynamic where the projector might subordinate their own needs, desires, or opinions to protect the ideal image of the partner. They lose themselves a bit.
Precisely. It prevents genuine intimacy, which requires acknowledging both the good and the bad in both partners.
This is fascinating. It really shows that psychological defenses don't always look like overt aggression or blaming. And didn't the research also note that the style of defense mechanism people tend to use is often gendered, following traditional socialization patterns again?
That's right. The research findings indicated that personality characteristics traditionally coded as feminine correlated more with using internalizing defenses.
Internalizing, like turning things inward.
Exactly. Turning aggression inward onto the self, leading to self-blame, subordination, maybe denial of anxiety or distress, trying to keep the peace at all costs.
The masculine characteristic.
Inversely, those correlated more with using externalizing defenses.
So turning things outward.
Right. Blaming others, aggressive acting out, displacing anger onto safer targets, and generally using those negative conflict resolution styles we talked about, hostility, aggression.
Wow. Okay, that's a really powerful framework for understanding conflict dynamics through a gendered lens without resorting to stereotypes, but looking at defense patterns. If a man, socialized traditionally, tends to externalize,
he is perhaps more likely to use aggressive language in conflict, displace his own uncomfortable feelings like inadequacy or fear, and label his partner as the source of the problem. You're the narcissist. You're the crazy one.
And if a woman, perhaps socialized differently, tends to internalize,
she might be more likely to blame herself for the relationship failure, even if she's being mistreated. Or she might use subordination, giving in, trying to appease to keep the peace, which ironically often leads to her own legitimate distress or symptoms being dismissed or misdiagnosed by others, maybe as BPD or DPD, as we discussed earlier.
This analysis fundamentally shifts the whole perspective on relationship conflict, doesn't it?
It really does.
It moves the conversation away from this endless, fruitless quest to blame the partner for being pathological, for being the narcissist.
And redirects it inward, towards understanding the psychological baggage, the unconscious material that the accuser might be carrying and projecting into the dynamic.
So we stop asking, okay, who is the real narcissist here?
And we start asking, what unconscious material, what old wounds or fears are being projected and reenacted in this relationship right now?
That kind of redirection, it necessitates a really major paradigm shift, doesn't it? Especially in how we approach relationship counseling or just how couples try to resolve things themselves, moving away from moralistic blame.
And toward more scientific, maybe more compassionate, actionable frameworks. Because the limitation of just calling someone a narcissist or abusive, while sometimes feeling validating in the moment, is that it focuses entirely on assigning fault.
And it's driven by the very projective mechanism, that persecuting projective identification that's actually causing the distress in the first place. It just fuels the fire.
Exactly. The moralizing language, the language of diagnosis and blame used as weapons, it's essentially an adversarial approach. It's ultimately unproductive for healing because the goal shouldn't be to assign fault. The goal should be to create connection, understanding, and regulation.
So what's the alternative? You mentioned a contemporary advanced trend in couple therapy, shifting focus away from moral diagnosis.
Yes, shifting entirely towards neurobehavioral language.
Neurobehavioral language. Tell us about this new view. You mentioned leaders like Stan Tatkin and his PACT approach, psychobiological approach to couple therapy. What does conflict look like through this lens?
Stan Tatkin's PACT approach, and others like it, represent a really profound integration of different fields. Developmental neuroscience, attachment theory, arousal regulation.
Yeah.
And the new view reframes conflict entirely. The conflict is no longer seen primarily as a sign of moral failing or inherent personality pathology in one partner.
It's not about who's bad.
No. It's understood more as differences in how partners' nervous systems operate, how they regulate arousal, how they perceive threat, and how they attempt to seek safety.
Okay, can you give an example? How would that translation work? Instead of thinking my partner is selfish and cold.
The therapist, using a PACT lens, might help the couple translate that into something like, okay, it seems like my partner's nervous system is highly threat-driven and perhaps risk-averse. And when they sense uncertainty or potential conflict, their system defaults to withdrawal or shutting down as a protective measure.
Whereas my nervous system might default to pursuing, maybe getting louder, seeking immediate resolution because that feels safer to me.
Exactly. That is the essential shift. PACT focuses intensely on promoting what Tatkin calls secure functioning principles, things like fairness, justice, collaboration, sensitivity, cooperation, and crucially, on mitigating threat reactions in the here and now.
How do they do that? Mitigate threat reactions?
The clinical work emphasizes paying close attention to moment-by-moment implicit and explicit behaviors. We're talking micro-expressions, tiny shifts in posture, tone of voice, eye contact, micro-movements.
Why so granular?
Because these are the observable, real-time indicators of underlying neurobiological states, states of arousal, states of threat, states of safety. And understanding and managing those states is considered far more crucial for change than making broad moral character judgments.
So the goal isn't to diagnose character, but to help partners become better regulators of each other's nervous systems.
Precisely. The goal is to help the couple establish secure functioning interdependence, where they actively and skillfully serve as each other's primary regulators of stress, distress, and also comfort and excitement. They learn to read each other's cues and respond in ways that promote safety.
The core skill, then, it really shifts. It's not about identifying who is sick or wrong. It's about identifying how to create safety in the interaction.
You've got it.
And this relies heavily on the neurobiological science, particularly the polyvagal theory developed by Stephen Porges, right?
Absolutely. This is really the core mechanism underpinning relational repair in these models. Porges's polyvagal theory gives us a map of how our autonomic nervous system operates.
Can you give us the quick version?
Sure. It posits three main hierarchical states. The oldest is the dorsal vagal complex associated with immobilization, freeze, shutdown, collapse. Then there's the sympathetic nervous system driving fight or flight, mobilization, high arousal. And the newest, unique to mammals, is the ventral vagal complex, which governs social engagement, connection, feeling safe and calm.
So to move past threat responses, fight, flight, or freeze, we need to activate that ventral vagal system, the social engagement system.
That's the key. We need to bring the ventral vagal system online.
And the critical concept needed to activate that system, you said, is neuroception of safety. How is neuroception different from just simple perception?
Great question. Perception is conscious. Like, I see the door's locked, I hear the house is quiet, so I perceive I am safe. Neuroception, however, is automatic, subconscious. It's the nervous system's constant, ongoing evaluation of risk in the environment, happening below the level of conscious thought.
Like a background surveillance system.
Exactly. And for partners who have experienced past trauma, neglect, or significant misattunement, their neuroception system might be faulty. It's often wired to perceive threat, even when objective risk is low. Their nervous system jumps into fight, flight, or freeze much more easily.
So healing, or just having a productive conversation, fundamentally starts when a therapist, or perhaps more importantly, a partner, can provide consistent, authentic signals that are neurocepted as safe.
Precisely. It's about creating that felt sense of safety at a nervous system level.
So this feeling of safety, it's not something we can just talk ourselves into logically. Don't worry, be happy.
Not usually, no. Especially not when highly triggered. It has to be communicated non-verbally, implicitly, nervous system to nervous system.
And how is that done? How is safety communicated non-verbally?
This is where the ventral vagal key comes in, as Porges describes it. The ventral vagus nerve, sometimes called the smart vagus, is what mediates our social engagement system. When it's activated in someone, it physiologically inhibits the fight or flight response, sympathetic arousal, and the collapse freeze response, dorsal vagal shutdown.
Okay, so how does one person activate their ventral vagus to help someone else feel safe?
It's primarily through the calm, grounded, present moment awareness and expression of the person offering safety. Their presence is the key.
How does that presence translate into something the other person's nervous system can actually register? What are the cues?
It's communicated through very specific, often subtle, cues of safety that our primitive brain reads instantly, bypassing conscious interpretation. Things like maintaining an open, relaxed body posture, offering soft, non-threatening eye contact, and, crucially, using rich vocal prosody.
Vocal prosody, you mean like tone of voice?
Yes, but more than just tone. It's the pitch, the rhythm, the timbre, the melody of the voice. Think about how a distressed baby often instantly calms the moment a parent picks them up and speaks in that soft, rhythmic, cooing voice.
Ah, right. That's a powerful example.
That is the parent's ventral vagus activating the infant's ventral vagus through those specific auditory cues. So in a couple's conflict, when one partner can manage their own arousal and maintain soft eye contact, a relatively relaxed posture, and speak with a calm, varied, warm vocal prosody,
they are literally sending signals to the other partner's autonomic nervous system saying, I am not a threat. You are safe with me right now.
Exactly. It's biological communication.
So the therapist or the partner trying to de-escalate isn't just passively listening. They're actively using their own physiological state, their regulated presence, their vocal tone as a tool, as a regulatory mechanism for the other person.
That's the core idea. The research on therapy effectiveness consistently shows that the therapeutic presence, the quality of the therapist being fully present, receptive, attuned, and non-judgmentally engaged, is one of the most consistent predictors of positive outcome, often more so than specific techniques.
Because that presence is what actually elicits the neuroception of safety.
Precisely. It allows the other person's nervous system to relax its rigid defenses, to come out of fight, flight, freeze, and become available for connection and collaborative problem solving.
And this leads directly to the idea of co-regulation in action.
Yes. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, biologically wired to co-regulate our nervous systems with trusted others. Safety and regulation aren't purely internal, isolated tasks we do on our own. They're deeply embedded in our relationships.
So co-regulation is like our nervous system syncing up.
In a way, yes. It's often described as the bidirectional linkage of oscillating physiological and emotional states between partners. When one partner, or the therapist, intentionally uses their ventral vagal key, their calm, attuned presence, their regulated nervous system literally helps the other partner's dysregulated nervous system downshift from a state of threat.
So my calm helps you become calm, and potentially your calm helps me stay calm. It's a feedback loop.
It's exactly that. Bidirectional communication at the level of the nervous system.
This really flips the script. It means the most effective relationship work, maybe the most effective way to navigate conflict generally, relies much more on prioritizing how you are being in the interaction. Are you attuned, present, signaling safety, grounded, rather than just focusing on what you do, the specific argument you make, the technique you try, or the moral judgments and labels you might be tempted to use.
That's the heart of the shift. It moves us away from analyzing and labeling a person's personality, which was the great flaw we identified in the cultural narcissism narrative.
Right, that static blaming label.
And moves us toward understanding and soothing their moment-to-moment physiology, their nervous system state.
The fundamental shift then is away from asking, is my partner a narcissist, and how can I fix them or protect myself from them?
Yes, away from that, and towards asking questions like, are our nervous systems currently co-regulating a sense of safety between us? Mm-hmm. Or are we stuck in a reactive cycle of threat detection and defense, likely based on old projected material from our pasts?
And the goal of therapy, or just conscious relationship work under this framework, becomes helping partners recognize these cycles.
To move past those old automatic defenses and actually exercise the neural muscles, the pathways for creating and maintaining safety together, building new, more flexible, more resilient ways of responding to each other.
That has been an incredibly deep and I think really critical exploration today.
It covers a lot of ground.
We started by questioning that really powerful, pervasive cultural narrative, the one that insists on labeling the female narcissist. And we learned that the actual clinical diagnosis of NPD, according to the official manual, the DSM-5, overwhelmingly favors men. Not necessarily because more men are narcissistic, but because the manual structure is biased towards capturing grandiose, overt traits, the presentation more historically associated with male socialization.
Right. And then we discovered that when women do display narcissistic traits, it often manifests differently through that vulnerable, shame-based, hypersensitive side of the pathology.
And that vulnerable presentation is frequently mislabeled by clinicians, perhaps due to gender stereotyping, perhaps due to the DSM's limitations as borderline or dependent personality disorders, disorders already traditionally associated with women.
Which perpetuates the cycle and hides the potential underlying narcissism.
And then, maybe more profoundly, we uncovered that many of these intense relationship accusations, these confident pronouncements of, you're a narcissist, they might not be accurate clinical diagnoses at all.
But rather, they could be manifestations of these deep unconscious defense mechanisms, specifically projective identification.
Where we essentially transfer our own unwanted baggage, our past childhood conflicts, our own fears and deficiencies onto our partner, unconsciously forcing them into a toxic role that seems to confirm our worst fears about relationships or about ourselves.
It's a painful cycle driven by the past.
And finally, we saw that the most promising path forward in modern relationship understanding and therapy seems to move decisively away from assigning these destructive moralistic labels to partners.
Yes, away from the blame game.
And instead, it advocates for a more scientific, more nuanced approach, one focused squarely on neurobiology.
Understanding that chronic conflict so often stems from our nervous systems getting locked in these cycles of threat detection and defense.
And realizing that the greatest tool we have for repair isn't better moral judgment or sharper accusations,
but rather intentional, regulated presence. It's about learning the skills of co-regulating safety within the relationship itself, using our connection not as a battlefield, but as a resource for mutual healing and calm.